Every government on Earth is deep in debt, yet those same governments can print more money whenever they choose. That paradox sits at the center of the modern world, and almost nobody asks where it came from. If printing money is so simple, why do politicians warn that the nation is running out of funds? Why do schools close and roads crack in countries that own printing presses and can order new currency? The answer stretches back centuries through wars, revolutions, and the slow building of a financial system built on borrowed faith. Welcome to the Market Antiquarian, where history and finance reveal how the world really works. Subscribe to stay informed. To understand this paradox, we must travel back to ancient China, where the first experiment with paper wealth began. Long before paper money existed, merchants in ancient China carried heavy copper coins on trade routes through steep mountains. Those coins were so heavy that a merchant could not carry enough metal for a large deal without hiring guards. Around the year 618, during the Tang Dynasty, merchants began leaving coins at deposit houses and receiving paper receipts. Those receipts could be traded with any merchant who trusted the deposit house that had issued the original paper. This was one of the earliest systems where paper stood in place of real metal, and trust made it work. The moment trust broke, the receipts became worthless, and the exchange system collapsed like a market stall swept by floodwater. Chinese emperors noticed this system and saw something powerful in it, because controlling paper meant controlling commerce across the empire. By the Song dynasty in the 10th century, the Chinese government had created the first official paper currency in human history. They called it jiaozi, backed by iron coins, silk and silver held in government vaults across major trading cities. Officials printed jiaozi at printing houses in Chengdu, sending the notes to merchants through licensed exchange stations across the region. For a time, the system worked well, and trade expanded as merchants moved paper instead of heavy copper coins. But wars cost enormous sums, and dynasties under military threat began doing something that would repeat throughout all of history. They printed far more paper than reserves held, flooding cities like Kaifeng and Hangzhou with notes worth less than the metal. Prices of rice, silk, and grain climbed in Chinese market stalls, and ordinary people found their savings buying less each season. By the 13th century, Mongol rulers had taken control and created a currency called the Chow, which Marco Polo witnessed. Polo wrote that Kublai Khan could create wealth simply by ordering paper to be stamped at the imperial mint in Khanbalik. He described this to Europeans as a miracle, because in Europe, wealth meant gold coins you could hold in your hand. What Polo did not see was that the Chow already suffered from the same problem that had broken earlier paper currencies. The Mongol Empire printed Chow to fund campaigns across Persia, Korea, and Southeast Asia, and each campaign required even more notes. By the late 1300s, the Chow had collapsed so far that peasants across China refused to accept imperial paper for grain. This would not be the last empire to learn this lesson, and ordinary people always paid the highest price. The pattern was now set. Paper money issued by power expanded beyond its backing, then collapsed under unchecked expansion. Across the ocean in Europe, paper money arrived much later, but the same tension arrived with it from the start. In 17th century Sweden, a banker named Johann Palmstruck founded the Stockholm Banco with permission from the Swedish crown in 1656. Sweden at that time used copper plates as coins, so dense that a single large denomination weighed over 14 kilograms. Carrying those copper plates to pay for land or ships was impractical, and Palmstruck saw an opportunity to solve this. In 1661, the Stockholm Banco issued the first banknotes in European history, documents promising payment in copper coins on demand. Swedish merchants and traders welcomed the notes because they made commerce faster and far less exhausting for everyone. But Palmstruck issued far more notes than the bank held in copper, lending heavily to Swedish nobles requesting credit. When depositors arrived, demanding copper for notes, Palmstruck did not have enough metal in the vaults to pay all of them. The bank failed publicly in 1668. Palmstruck was arrested and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later reduced to prison. The Swedish government seized banking operations and created the Riksbank, now one of the oldest central banks on Earth. This early disaster proved something critical, that paper money systems without strict discipline could destroy savings, trust, and careers. Over in England, a similar experiment was underway. Driven by the pressure of expensive war with France in the 1690s, King William III needed funds to fight Louis XIV, but the English treasury was nearly empty after years of costly conflict. A Scottish entrepreneur named William Paterson proposed a bold solution to English merchants and government officials in London in 1694. Patterson proposed that private investors lend £1.2 million to the government in exchange for the right to create a bank. That institution would issue banknotes to the public, earn interest on the government loan, and manage national debt permanently. Parliament agreed, and on July 27 of 1694, the Bank of England was established with offices on Grosvenor Hall Court. From its founding, the Bank of England was a private institution with a public function tied permanently to government debt. The government owed the bank money from day one, and the bank issued notes through commerce, linking debt and money supply. This was a new idea in finance, one that would reshape the entire global economic system over the following 3 centuries. The Bank of England could expand money supply when needed, and the government depended on that expansion to fund its operations. But every expansion came with a cost, because every new note was a debt that someone would eventually repay with interest. War after war in Europe pushed governments to borrow more, print more, and accumulate debts that grew larger every decade. France experienced this pressure more violently than any other nation, and consequences moved from ledger books into the streets of Paris. By 1789, the French government owed enormous sums to foreign creditors and the church, while ordinary people struggled to buy bread. French King Louis XVI held emergency meetings at the Palace of Versailles, but no solution could fix the fundamental imbalance. When revolution broke out in 1789 and the monarchy collapsed, the new government inherited a financial disaster with no easy path. The revolutionary government held vast land seized from the church and fleeing aristocrats, and Talleyrand proposed using it as backing. In 1790, the French National Assembly created the assignat, backed by the value of confiscated church lands across France. Citizens could use assignats to buy government land at auction, and the notes would be destroyed after each completed sale. The early assignats held their value, and the system seemed like a creative solution to an impossible financial situation in Paris. But the revolution faced invading armies from Austria, Prussia, and most of the European powers, and military costs grew enormous. The National Assembly printed assignats faster than land could be sold, flooding French markets with hundreds of millions of livres. By 1795, France held over 40 billion livres in assignats, while the land backing those notes was worth only a fraction. Prices exploded across Paris, and a simple meal that once cost a few coins now required large stacks of paper notes. Farmers refused to bring grain to city markets because they did not trust the paper they would receive in payment. In 1796, the French government abolished the assignat, but the damage to public trust ran very deep across the country. Napoleon stabilized French finances by creating the Bank of France in 1800 and imposing strict discipline on money printing in Paris. Napoleon reportedly said he feared hostile bankers more than armed soldiers because he understood that financial power shaped political reality. The French experiment showed that a currency backed by land could work briefly before military pressure overwhelmed the backing entirely. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the young United States was living through its own version of the same story. During the American Revolution, Congress had no power to tax and held no gold to fund its war against the British. Congress began printing paper money called Continentals in 1775, promising redemption in silver once independence was secured. Soldiers at Valley Forge were paid in Continentals, but merchants and farmers across the colonies refused to accept the notes. By 1779, the continental currency had lost over 97% of its value, giving birth to the phrase, "not worth a continental." George Washington wrote from his headquarters that the financial collapse was more dangerous to the American cause than British cannon fire. The founding generation learned a painful lesson from the continental collapse, shaping every major financial debate in the early republic. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, proposed a solution to the deep financial crisis facing the new nation. Hamilton argued that the federal government should assume all war debts of the individual states, totaling about $80 million. He also proposed a national bank to manage debt, issue notes, and stabilize commerce across the new nation. Jefferson and Madison fiercely opposed the plan, arguing that a central bank would concentrate financial power in the hands of elites. The Hamilton and Jefferson debate was not merely technical, it was a profound conflict about what kind of nation this would become. Hamilton won, and the first Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791, beginning the long relationship with institutional debt. The debate never ended, and the first bank charter expired in 1811 as Congress blocked every effort to renew its license. A second attempt succeeded in 1816 when Congress chartered the second. Bank of the United States. After the War of 1812, President Andrew Jackson despised the second bank, believing it placed vast power in the hands of wealthy merchants and foreign investors. Jackson believed gold coins in the hands of citizens offered more protection than paper notes managed by distant banking institutions. Jackson vetoed the bank recharter in 1832 and withdrew all federal deposits from its vaults. He paid off the entire national debt in January 1835, making the United States the only nation in history to do so, but without a central bank. The United States economy swung between booms and panics that left farmers and workers in ruin. 2 years later, a severe financial panic struck the United States, and historians have debated whether those two events were connected. The 1837 panic left banks closing their doors across New York City as depositors lined up demanding their money. Without a central bank as a lender of last resort, individual banks across the country simply collapsed one after another. That collapse revealed a flaw the Founding Fathers never solved. What happens when there is no lender of last resort? The United States economy would face similar panics in 1857, 1873, 1893, and 1907, each more damaging to ordinary people. The 1907 panic began when speculators in New York tried to corner the copper market and failed, shaking Wall Street. J.P. Morgan gathered wealthy financiers in his Manhattan library to stop the collapse and prevent the nation from financial ruin. Morgan pledged millions and convinced other New York bankers to do the same, acting as a private central bank. When the 1907 crisis passed, politicians realized a nation of 80 million people could not depend on one private banker. The Jekyll Island meeting lasted 9 days, producing a blueprint for the institution that would manage American money for generations. Senator Nelson Aldrich convened a secret meeting in November 1910 at a hunting club on Jekyll Island, off Georgia. 6 men traveled to Jekyll Island under false names to design a new American central banking system in complete secrecy. Those 6 men represented roughly 1/4 of all the wealth on Earth at that single moment on Jekyll Island. Their plan eventually became the Federal Reserve Act, signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson on December 23 of 1913. The Federal Reserve System created 12 regional banks across the United States, each lending to commercial banks during crises. For the first time, the United States had a permanent institution capable of managing the money supply through crisis. But the Federal Reserve was a hybrid institution owned partly by private banks and overseen by a government board. That structure placed the Federal Reserve in a gray zone between public accountability and private financial interests from the start. The new system faced its first catastrophic test less than 2 decades later when Wall Street prices began collapsing. The Federal Reserve had been created to prevent this crisis, and yet the worst financial collapse in history had begun. On October 24 of 1929, known as Black Thursday, millions of shares changed hands on the New York Stock Exchange. By October 29, known as Black Tuesday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had fallen so far that decades of savings were gone. Banks that had lent heavily to stock speculators began calling in loans, and borrowers across the country could not pay. Bank runs spread from city to city as depositors saw photographs of long lines forming outside banks in New York and Chicago. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks in the United States failed, wiping out the savings of millions of families. Economists, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, argued the Federal Reserve made the Great Depression worse by reducing the money supply. Instead of expanding money to ease the crisis, the Federal Reserve allowed the money supply to shrink by 1/3. Breadlines stretched for blocks in New York City, while farms across Oklahoma and Kansas sat abandoned and covered in dust. Roosevelt believed the gold standard had become a cage, trapping governments from taking action to rescue their own economies. President Franklin Roosevelt took office in March 1933 and immediately declared a national bank holiday, closing every bank nationwide. Roosevelt signed the Emergency Banking Act, allowing only financially sound banks to reopen, while weaker institutions were reorganized or closed. In 1933, Roosevelt signed an order requiring Americans to turn in their gold coins and certificates to Federal Reserve banks. Citizens received paper dollars for their gold, and the gold price was raised from $20 to $35 per ounce. This act effectively ended the domestic gold standard, severing the link between circulating paper money and gold held in reserve. Gold could still be used between governments, but ordinary Americans could no longer demand gold in exchange for paper bills. Roosevelt believed freeing money from the gold reserve constraint was necessary to fight the Depression and rebuild the frozen economy. Critics called it theft, while supporters called it the only way to inject enough money into the frozen national economy. Meanwhile, in Germany, a far more extreme version of this debate had already produced catastrophic consequences for millions of people. After losing the First World War, Germany was required to pay enormous reparations under the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The German government could not raise enough revenue to pay those reparations, and began printing German marks at the Reichsbank. By 1921, inflation in Germany was already severe, and by 1923 it had become something no textbook could fully describe. A loaf of bread in Berlin that cost 160 marks in 1922 cost 200 billion marks by November of 1923. The Rentenmark experiment proved something remarkable, that confidence in a currency could be rebuilt almost overnight with the right design. Workers in German factories were paid twice daily and ran to shops to spend wages before the money lost more value. Wheelbarrows of paper marks were photographed on German streets as people carried enormous bundles of currency just to buy food. The German hyperinflation of 1923 wiped out the savings of the middle class, destroying the economic foundation of a generation. Historians argued this financial trauma left deep wounds in German society that made the political extremism of the 1930s easier. Germany stabilized its currency in November 1923 by introducing the Rentenmark, backed by German agricultural land and industrial property. Each old mark was exchanged for 1 trillion new Rentenmarks, erasing the hyperinflation of the previous years in one conversion. The German experience proved that a government willing to print money without limit could destroy an entire nation from within. As the world rebuilt after the Second World War, the major Allied powers gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods. Delegates from 44 nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in 1944 to design a new international monetary system. The American economist Harry Dexter White and British economist John Maynard Keynes dominated the discussions at Bretton Woods. The system pegged all currencies to the United States dollar and pegged the dollar itself to gold at $35 an ounce. Every other nation would hold dollars as their primary reserve, and the United States guaranteed those dollars could be exchanged for gold. This made the United States dollar the foundation of the entire global financial system, unlike any currency before. The dollar flowed into global trade as American companies invested abroad. Military bases opened and foreign aid programs expanded worldwide. Foreign governments accumulated vast dollar reserves, trusting that those dollars could always be exchanged for American gold on demand. For the first time, the value of a currency rested entirely on the credibility of the government that issued it. For 2 decades, the Bretton Woods system worked well, supporting the post-war recovery of Western Europe and Japan simultaneously. But the Vietnam War cost the United States enormous sums, and the government printed dollars to fund the war. As more dollars circulated globally without matching gold reserves at Fort Knox, foreign governments grew increasingly worried. French President Charles de Gaulle publicly criticized the arrangement, arguing the United States was printing dollars and exporting inflation worldwide. In 1965, France began converting dollar reserves into gold, sending ships across the Atlantic to collect gold bars from Federal Reserve vaults. By 1971, the United States held only about $10 billion of gold at Fort Knox, while foreign governments held over $45 billion. On August 15 of 1971, President Nixon appeared from the Oval Office announcing the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. Nixon called it a temporary measure, but the gold window never reopened in the 5 decades since that Sunday night broadcast. With that announcement, the last formal link between the United States dollar and any physical commodity was permanently severed. Every major currency in the world was now backed by nothing more than the trust of the people who held it. Central banks began building enormous dollar reserves, making American monetary policy a global force with consequences for every nation. Economists call this system fiat currency, from the Latin word meaning "let it be done," because money exists because governments declare it. In a fiat currency world, central banks can create as much money as economic conditions and governments appear to require. But that freedom comes with a permanent tension, because every new dollar or yen created is also a form of debt. When the Federal Reserve creates new money, it does so by purchasing government bonds from banks and financial institutions. The government had previously sold those bonds to raise funds, promising to repay bondholders with interest at maturity. When the central bank buys those bonds, government debt does not disappear. It moves to the central bank balance sheet. The total debt stays exactly the same, but the money supply has grown, and the government owes money to its own central bank. This circular relationship between debt and money creation explains why every major economy carries a national debt that grows larger. The debt is not a failure of the system, it is the foundation of the system, because money itself is created through borrowing. The 2008 financial crisis tested this fiat system more severely than any event since the Great Depression of the 1930s. After the 2008 crisis, the Federal Reserve launched quantitative easing under Chairman Ben Bernanke, purchasing trillions of dollars in bonds. The Federal Reserve balance sheet grew from $900 billion in 2008 to over $4 trillion by 2015. When the global economy shut down in 2020, central banks around the world launched massive programs to prevent economic collapse. The United States Federal Reserve purchased over $3 trillion in assets within just months of the pandemic reaching American shores. The total United States debt, which took over 200 years to reach $1 trillion, crossed $30 trillion in 2023. Every nation that prints its own currency faces this structural reality, because the system was built to work through debt. The paradox that opened this story was never a flaw in the design. It was the design built from China to Washington. Money exists because governments declare it. Debt grows because money is created through borrowing. And the printing press runs because stopping was always worse. Every financial panic and collapse in this story happened not because money was printed, but because trust in that money broke. The real question is not why nations are in debt, but how long the trust holding the global financial system will last. The past still has stories to tell. Subscribe, and let us uncover them together.